User accounts and security. In this nugget, we're going to be focused on some of the core security features in Mac OS X. Now, we're going to be running across other security bits elsewhere in other nuggets, but this is just kind of going to give us a baseline for the main security stuff. We'll be talking about local user accounts. We'll talk about the situation with Macs and anti-malware, antiviruses, anti-spyware, and so forth. We'll look at a couple of important security features called File Vault and the local firewall. Talk about some of the miscellaneous security features that are floating around. And we'll talk about one application's security in particular because it's such an important application in terms of security, and that's the built-in Safari web browser. We're going to be bopping around through different places in OS X. A lot of these, like System Preferences and Safari, are things that we will look at in more depth in later nuggets. However, we're just going to focus on their security aspects in this nugget. The first thing I want to get out of the way, though, is this idea that somehow Mac computers are less vulnerable to viruses than Windows-based computers. It's just not true. Now, the fact is that viruses are written by people, and just like most programmers, they want to write for a platform that will get them the most possible exposure. So basically, there are more viruses that affect Windows-based machines simply because there are more Windows-based machines. But there have and continue to be Mac-based viruses. For example, when Apple released their iWork 09 product, it immediately showed up on some BitTorrents in a pirated form for people who wanted the product but didn't want to pay for it. And that torrent copy actually included a nice Trojan virus. And it affected a lot of Mac machines because a lot of people on Macs don't run any kind of anti-malware software. We're talking antivirus, anti-spyware, and so forth. Largely because of this impression that Macs are somehow invulnerable. Macs are less likely to get a virus simply because there are currently fewer viruses being written for a Mac. But if you don't have protection, then when someone does write a virus, well, guess what? You're going to get it. So hop on Google. A simple search for Mac antivirus will turn up several different options for you. All the big players in this market, Symantec, McAfee, they all make a Mac version these days. Plus, there are several different ones that are just for Macs. So if you look through the sponsored links on Google, you're going to find tons. You can do some research, find out which ones you like, which ones you don't like, and sort of go from there. Now, sometimes, if you're using some of Apple's extra services, for example, if you're a subscriber to their .Mac service, then they will provide you with an antivirus program. So you may be able to go that route too. Check into that, check with Apple, and see what sort of benefits you may have. But you want to get something running on the machine. Okay, so next step, let's move on to the System Preferences area where we're going to look at logon accounts. Logon accounts are, of course, the first level of security you run into. So we'll jump into the System Preferences pane and go to Accounts under System. Now, here's the account I've set up for myself on this computer. As you can see, you can attach a little picture to it. You can specify a username, and that username can have spaces. That can be a little confusing compared to a Windows system where the actual logon name doesn't. If you are connecting the computer to Apple's MobileMe service, then you can specify your username there too. And that actually really plays into some of the other features that we'll talk about in later nuggets. So if you do have a MobileMe account on the computer, it is really important to make sure that the right account name is attached there. You can specify an address book card for yourself. It's not really necessary. It's just kind of like an Outlook, how you can designate a particular address or contact entry as you. And there's a couple of programs that use that. You'll notice that my account is set up as an admin, and I can specify different login items, things that will automatically start. Now, these are things that Apple sets up automatically. The Airport Base Station agent will start automatically, and the iTunes Helper agent will start automatically. Both of those things actually happen to run in the background. If you find that you've got an application that you are setting to start up at login and you don't want that to happen, or you don't want to see it on the dock, you just want it to run, then you can click the little hide checkbox. Now there's a couple of ways to add something to this list. You can obviously hit the little plus down here, pick an application and add it. Another neat thing is you can drag things to it from elsewhere. So I'm going to open up a Finder window here, and let's say I want my Documents folder to to show up, or a different folder, all I have to do is drag that in, and that will automatically bring it up. Now, if you've connected to another resource, a shared computer, a file share on a Windows server, that'll show up here in the Finder sidebar, and you can actually drag these items over to the startup as well. And that will make that connection automatically recur every single time you log in. So that's definitely useful. You'll notice that I can't add an account. I should be able to, but the plus and minus buttons are grayed out, and that's because this lock button is closed. Most of the system preferences panes that we'll look at have this lock button, and a few are locked down by default. So to make changes, I click the lock, type my password. That unlocks things, and now I can go ahead and add another account. I can create a standard user account, an admin, an account that is going to be managed by the parental controls feature, or an account that's only used for sharing. And that's what this guest account is. And those accounts cannot log on locally. They can't log on interactively, but they can be used to access resources that are being shared by this computer. You can also create group accounts if you want to group a bunch of different users together and then assign permissions to them. Now keep in mind that these are all local accounts. These have nothing to do with anything like Active Directory or anything else. They're just like the local accounts that would live on a Windows computer. This just happens to be where you get to them. Clicking Login Options takes you to a totally separate pane where you can set a few system-wide preferences. For example, I have this system set to automatically log in the Don Jones account every time it boots. If you've got systems and they're only going to be used by one user, such as in the case of a laptop, for example, which typically get used by one user, it might be easiest to have it automatically log in with their account. When a login window is displayed, do I want to display a list of users or just prompt for a name and a password? Name and a password is a little bit more secure. If you're displaying a list of users, then you're telling a potential attacker, well, here are all the accounts you can try. If you're just asking for a name and a password, then they're not even getting that much of a clue. I am going to allow the Restart, Sleep, and Shutdown buttons to be shown on that login window. I am not going to show the input menu on the login window, so if someone is trying to use an alternative input entry means, a virtual keyboard or a foreign character palette or something like that, that won't be shown. I will show password hints, and when I go to create a new account, you can see that you can specify a password hint. This is just a little bit of text you can type to kind of clue someone in. So if they forget their password, they can ask for a hint. I'm choosing to go ahead and display that information. And if your system is going to be accessed by someone who may have some access disabilities, and they might need voice-over reading to read them, the prompts and so forth, then you can enable the voice-over feature. Fast user switching allows one user to stay logged on while switching to another user account, so multiple people can be accessing the system, not at the same time, but their programs and stuff can continue running. They don't have to log off in order to allow someone else to log on. And this is just warning that that's the case. Mac OS X does a decent job of partitioning off the different user sessions, but it's not impossible for one user to access programs that are running by another user, because they do have access to the computer and everything is running on the same computer. I'm going to cancel that out. And those are the basic things you need to worry about over on this pane. Before I leave, I'm going to make sure I lock this one back up again, just so no one else can come in here and change these things without my knowing. And we're now going to click Show All to go back to the main portion of System Preferences and look at some of the other security features. And probably the next good one to look at is up here in Personal, where I've got an icon for security. So we've got three basic tabs here: General, File Vault, and Firewall. Let's cover each one. The General one is pretty much just what it says. It's general purpose security settings, such as requiring a password if this computer goes to sleep or enters its screensaver. So you've got to have a password to get out of that, and that password would be your login password, not a separate password. For all accounts on this computer, do I want to disable automatic login, even if I enabled it on the last pane? Do I want to require a password to unlock every single System Preferences pane? So in other words, some of these System Preferences panes, when they're locked, and many of them aren't locked by default don't require a password because they're considered kind of low risk, I guess you could say. Well, this option here would require a password for every single system preferences pane. So you lock down the whole system preferences application. You can automatically force a log out after a certain number of minutes of activity, and you can use secure virtual memory. In other words, virtual memory is kind of like the Windows swap file. It's an area of disk that the operating system can use to page sections of memory if it needs more memory than it physically has. Well, this tells it to secure that information. Now, most newer Macs have a built-in infrared receiver for an infrared remote control that's used to run the media features. And for the most part, that's not really considered a security problem. It can be used to transmit data, but for the most part, the only application that uses it is something called Front Row, which is like a media player. The only thing that's irritating about it is I was in an office once where we had about 4 people sitting back to back, and they all had iMacs. And there were newer iMacs that had the built-in infrared receiver. And one guy decided he would start playing with his. Well, he didn't realize that even though he was pointing the remote at his Mac, some of the infrared signal was bouncing off the glass screen and hitting all the people behind him. And so their Macs were also responding to his remote. And I don't know that it was a security issue, but it was very irritating. Once he realized he was doing it, and once he realized how irritating it was, he started doing it a lot. So you've got 2 choices to stop that. You can use this pair button to pair your Mac or a Mac with a particular remote control. And this gives you directions for doing that. So that Mac will only respond to that remote. And most of the Macs that have an infrared receiver actually come with a remote. Option 2 is to disable the remote control infrared receiver on this computer. Boom. Done. That'll go away. Option 3, I guess, would be to walk around and just collect all the remote controls that came with the Macs and lock them up somewhere. In an office environment, people aren't likely to need those things anyway, and clearly they're just going to lead to grief. Now, that's not going to stop someone from going to the Apple Store and dropping $30 on a replacement remote, but if they're going to do that, well, maybe they've earned a little bit of fun. So you can kind of decide on that. Okay, so those are the general settings. FileVault works a very little bit like the Windows encrypting file system. This guy is only intended to encrypt the content of your home folder. So if we go into Finder and you come over here to the sidebar, and the little icon with the house and your username, that's your home folder. It's got your desktop, your documents, anything you've downloaded, your library, which will include your iTunes music, all the iLife applications store your projects here, your movies, your music, your pictures from iPhoto, and so forth. So all that lives here, right in your home folder. So you probably, if this is a laptop, I'm trying to kind of think of scenarios where you might want to definitely use this. If this is a laptop and it's going to be walking out of the company and there's a chance it's going to be stolen, then enabling FileVault for your home folder can be useful. If your users are storing their data locally in their home folder, if you've set up folders elsewhere where they're going to be keeping stuff, then FileVault's not going to help. So there's no built-in way to encrypt the entire volume. Now, when you do enable FileVault, your files get encrypted using your login password. If you forget that password, you have a master password, and this is the backup. And you probably do want to set this. So we'll type a password. We'll type it again to verify it, and we'll provide a hint. Something vague, like if you've got a corporate-wide master password, then you might just put normal, so that anybody else who's using the machine will go, oh, well, okay, this is our normal master password for Macs. And then you have to turn FileVault on, and this has to be done on a per-account basis. Now, if you remember back in the login panel, we were also able to enable FileVault on a per-account basis there. So this button is going to turn it on for the current account that I'm logged on with. I'm not going to do it because it's going to take a while. The more stuff you have in your home folder, the longer this will take to turn on, and I've got some rather large files there. So the last tab is the Firewall tab. Macs have a built-in firewall. It's turned on by default. It will only allow incoming connections for essential services. things that the Mac needs to operate, typically things that you've enabled, like file sharing or print sharing, and in a later nugget we'll look at how to enable those things. So it works a lot like the Windows firewall on Windows in that regard. You can allow all incoming connections if that's what you want to do. And you can set access for specific services and applications. So if you enable either of these second checkboxes or radio buttons, you can add more applications. You can say, well, DVD player may listen for an incoming connection, so I'll add that one. I'm going to leave it on allow all incoming connections for now so we can play around. Ooh, the other thing is, if you do want to allow essential services or set access for specific services and applications, you can set some advanced options. You can enable logging, and that's turned on by default, and it will recycle that log. So it's not going to infinitely fill up your hard drive. The reason I like that is because if you're trying to troubleshoot, if the Mac is not working with something and you think it might be due to the firewall, logging allows you to open a text file and see what connections are being dropped. And that will tell you or help you figure out what's going on. This stealth mode is if you're kind of paranoid. Normally, when an incoming connection is denied by the firewall will deny the connection. It won't just sit there and go and ignore the connection. It will actually deny the connection. That tells a potential attacker that there is a computer there and that there is a firewall running. So by enabling stealth mode, you're telling the Mac, hey, when an incoming connection comes in and you plan to deny it, don't say anything. Be very quiet. Just shh. So it won't even deny the connection. It'll just pretend that there's no computer there. Makes it a little bit tougher to troubleshoot things because you don't get the same firewall logging either. But it does make the computer a little bit more secure, a little bit more stealthy. So again, I'm going to leave this at allow all incoming connections, just for some of the things that we'll be covering in future nuggets. And going back to the System Preferences panel, I think that should pretty much cover everything that we have from a security standpoint. Again, nugget number 9 is where we're going to dive into all these things in a little bit more detail. So let's close out System Preferences and talk about some of the security-specific things that are built into a couple of the more important built-in applications. And you know, I guess probably the two most important ones are the ones that interact the most with the internet. Mail, which we will have plenty of time to talk about in nugget number 12, and Safari, which is the built-in web browser. Now you'll notice that I've also installed the Firefox web browser. If you go and install non-Apple stuff on your system, understand that they may have separate security features. So I would need to go into Firefox and take a look at those. But I do want to spend a minute talking about the security features that are built into Safari. As you can see, when I launch Safari, nothing comes up. I have my home page preference set to just be a blank page. Just makes it a little bit of a quicker startup for me. We are going to go to the Safari menu and go into, let's look at a couple of things that aren't really easily visible on the preference menu, and they happen to be visible here. And one is the pop-up blocker. I think pretty much everybody wants that turned on. Know that it's here because there are some websites that need pop-up window functionality, and this is how you can go turn them back on. You can't turn this on and off for a specific website. If you're on a website that needs it, you need to turn it off, use that website, and then turn it back on. Emptying the cache, kind of a good security thing. You know, Safari caches web pages for speed, just like most web browsers do, and this option will let you empty the cache. And then this is the private browsing feature. What this does is it doesn't add web pages to the history when you browse them. Items that you download are automatically removed from Safari's little download list. When you enter information onto web pages during private browsing, that information is not saved in the autofill, including names and passwords, so it's not saved for later. And when you perform searches, they're not added to the pop-up menu. In other words, let's cancel this. When I go down here to Google, if I start typing Mac and hit space and type antivirus, actually I may have typed this earlier as just antivirus. Nope. So as you start to use Safari and as it starts to learn what you're doing, it'll start prompting you with different things here as you type. So when you're in private browsing, though, it won't remember any of your searches. And there's also some rules on cookies. Things like that aren't permanently saved. You know, private browsing is good when you really don't want any local traces of where you've been browsing. So for the rest of our security related stuff, we're going to go into the Preferences menu here. We'll start with General. Not really a lot of security related stuff here. These are just general behavior things that we'll have a chance to talk about later. Nothing on the Appearance tab, nothing on the Bookmarks tab, and nothing on the Tabs tab. RSS. Autofill can definitely come into security. What this is every time you fill out a form on a web page, Safari is going to remember the values you typed into the form fields, and in future sessions, it will try to automatically fill in forms with that same information. You can give it access to your address book card, so it can fill in your name and your address and so forth. You can let it try and remember usernames and passwords as well as other form data. Turning these off is more secure only if other users are going to be using this computer. Now, if other users are going to be using this computer and they're not logging on under their own user account, in other words, if everybody has a shared user account, well, then Safari is going to offer to remember usernames and passwords for everybody. If you've got users logging on under separate usernames, though, logging onto the computer with separate usernames, then autofill will be separate for each of them. It won't be shared between them. We're going to skip the security tab for just a sec because that's too obvious. And yeah, the advanced tab doesn't really have any security related things either, except this develop menu. You really can't stop your users from turning this on, and the develop menu is not really so much of a security risk, but it may let your users do some things that are security sensitive. For example, they can change the user agent that the browser sends so that they can have the browser seem like a different browser. They can make it pretend to be IE7. They can disable caching and images and styles, and they can force pages to be open with different web browsers. So again, I don't know that this is a huge security thing, but just be aware that it is an opportunity for users to maybe get in trouble and maybe represent themselves as something they're not. You know, if for example, you've got an intranet application and it's relying on the user agent to separate Mac users from Windows users, by turning on the development menu and going to user agent, your Mac users can pretend to be Internet Explorer, which might defeat that intranet division of people. So I mean, just kind of be aware that that's there. So we'll go back to the Preferences menu and we'll look at that Security tab, because this is where most of the real security related things live. Phishing Filter. Warn when visiting a fraudulent website. That's turned on. What web content do you want to enable? Plugins, Java, JavaScript, and do you want to block pop-up windows? Here's the place you can get to the same setting if you want to dig. Do you want to accept cookies? Accept them all, accept none of them, which will break half the websites you visit, or only accept first-party cookies. Only accept cookies from the sites you navigate to. Do not accept cookies from people who might be advertising on those sites. And you can go in and look at the cookies. There's a little search thing in here, so let's see if Google has been handing me any cookies. And they've handed me a couple. So I can see what all those cookies are, where they came from. You know, Chrome, AdSense, Analytics, and so forth, and I can see the contents of the cookie over here. You can make this window bigger if you want to get a little bit more visibility. You can resize these columns. You can see when the cookies expire and so forth. And I just love that feature, how it reformats the date based on how much room it has to work with. I just think that's so cool. So anyway, here's where you can sort of work with the cookies. You can remove selected cookies. You can remove all cookies that are displayed. This is kind of neat. If you want to wipe out all the cookies for a particular website, use the search box so that you're only looking at the cookies from that website. Let's see if I've got anything in here from Microsoft.com. Yeah, I do. So I can now remove all of the cookies from Microsoft.com. It's not removing every cookie in the system. It's just removing the ones that are displayed. So that, I think, is a really, really useful thing to know about. And finally, Safari has a local database feature called SQLite, and you can configure how much space is allowed. Once you go beyond that space, Safari will pop up and ask the user if they want to allocate more space. Currently, not very many websites have pages that utilize local databases, but you know, you may run into some. 5 megabytes is the default, and like cookies, you can sit and look to see what databases are there. So I've got this Stack Overflow user voice thing, and this is relying on persistent databases, and you'll see this a lot. In fact, you notice this on these two websites. And a lot of websites will often try as a test just to write a little bit of information to a database to see if it works or not, to see if they're working with a browser that has this feature, and to see if the feature's turned on, and then you can determine whether or not it's going to work that way, and then they'll go ahead and use their real, and this is the persistent storage, their real database that they intended to use. And you'll notice that megabyte setting that you set is per database initially, but you then can go in and change that for each individual database. So let's say you set 5 megabytes as your per database default, but you've got one intranet application and you want to let it use a lot, so you can go and give it as much room as you want. It won't allocate all that space right away. You're not losing that space if it's not being used, but it does set an upper limit before Safari will ask to see if it's allowed to get more. And the last one is to prompt users, ask before sending a non-secure form from a secure website. So if you're on an HTTPS page and you're filling out a form and that form is being submitted to a non-HTTPS web page, ask before doing that. And so those are the majority of the security features. We are going to come back to Safari again in Nugget 12, and we'll talk about its non-security features. But those are the things that you're going to worry about sort of, I think, right off the bat. In this nugget, we've talked about Mac OS X's security features, starting with user accounts. We talked about the anti-malware situation and the fact that there's no anti-malware included, but you need to have some. Macs do get affected by viruses and spyware, just like Windows. Maybe less frequently in the news, but it still happens. We looked at the File Vault, which is a great tool for laptops. It encrypts the contents of users' home directories. We talked about the local firewall on the Mac, and some of the miscellaneous security features that are floating around in the system preferences area. We also looked at one application security, Safari. And I really like to look at that one because I think Safari is such a good opportunity for bad security. Although I think the defaults are well configured, it's important to understand what those security options are. Just because on most operating systems, the web browser is the point of entry for things like malware and viruses and everything else. So it's good to understand where Safari's security features sit. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.